Hey folks, and welcome back to This State CD, the podcast dedicated to exploring the world of human-centered design and beyond. I'm Gerry Scullion, and whether you're new to human-centered design or a seasoned practitioner, this podcast is here to help you expand your thinking, challenge conventions, and drive meaningful change. Now, before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your network. And if you're looking to bring a human-centered service design approach into your organization, take the first step by signing up for my free 5-day email course. The link is in the description. In today's episode, I'm joined by two brilliant guests, Steve Baty, who I know from Australia, and Martin Tomitsch, co-authors of Designing Tomorrow. Now, we discussed the evolution of design from a human-centered design approach to a broader life-centered perspective, tackling the complexities of, say, sustainability, systems thinking, and a role of design in really helping shape the future. But there's three key takeaways from this episode. Number one, the shift to life-centered design. And human-centered design, as you know, has served us well. But as we face global challenges, designers must expand their scope to include environmental and societal impacts in their decision making. Number two, design's role in governance and business strategy. Design is no longer just about crafting these wonderful experiences. It has a role to play at the board level, helping organizations navigate uncertainty and ask the right questions for long-term impact. And number three, resilience in design careers. As designers work to embed more ethical, systemic thinking in organizations, maintaining resilience and finding support through communities and industry networks is absolutely critical to long-term success. This episode is packed with insights, and if you want to go deeper, I'm giving away a copy of Designing Tomorrow. So check out the description below for links on how you can find out to enter to win that book. Now, let's dive into the conversation with Steve Baty and Martin Tomitsch. Maybe we'll kick off. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from and what you do. We'll start off with alphabetical surnames. We'll start with Baty, Mr. Baty, Steve Baty. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what you do.
Well, thanks, Gerry. I am a Sydney local, so born and bred in Sydney, Australia. I currently live just to the sort of northwest of the Sydney CBD on the banks of the Parramatta River. Traditional lands of the Wongal clan, part of the Eora Nation in Sydney. I'm a design strategist, have worked in the sort of service design and strategic design space for a while now. Some people may know me as the host of UX Australia. Others may know me from my work at Meld Studios. I've been involved in the Australian Design Council, and I'm currently involved with the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence, among other things.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been active for a long time, as long as I've been in Australia anyway. But Martin, let's tell us about yourself.
So I am joining you today from Gadigal country here in Sydney. So I am at the moment still here in my UTS office, where I'm working at the Transdisciplinary School at UTS, the University of Technology, Sydney. I am originally from Austria, so I studied and did my PhD at the Vienna University of Technology. I'm born in Austria, and I grew up on an organic small farm in the mountains, sort of like the pre-Alps, the end of the Alps. And moved to Sydney about 16 years ago. Spent quite a few years at the University of Sydney in the design discipline. And yes, now have been at the Transdisciplinary School here at UTS for 2 years.
Amazing. Now, listen, I don't know if you've ever seen Star Wars, but this is my attempt of Star Wars introduction. Do you see what I'm doing there, Steve?
Perfect.
I got a smile. I am what's known as a jackass sometimes. So you wrote this book, Designing Tomorrow. How long is it out? It's about a year, or no, 6 months, is it? 6 months, a year.
It was released in Australia in April 2024, and it had its European release. I think it's sort of November 2023. Martin, I think, was the formal release out of Amsterdam and in Europe. Yeah,
nice, and it's on BIS, which is one of my favorite publishers as well. instantly
They're
be.
great to work with.
They're great.
They
Yeah.
are, yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, they give a voice to a community of people who want to, inform better outcomes for planet and society, and that kind of encapsulates what I think a lot has gone on in this. So let's talk. You're both design strategists. In I think, don't know if you called yourself that, Martin, but there's been a shift in the last maybe 5 to 10 years in particular, from human-centered design into this life-centered design, or taken into consideration into planetary kind of considerations as well. What do you think is driving this? Where does it come from?
Do you want me to start, Steve?
Yeah.
And you jump in. I don't know if I would call myself a design strategist. And,
Okay.
And we also actually do make a subtle but important distinction between design strategy and strategic design.
Okay.
I do see myself, I'm trained kind of like more in information design, and I've been teaching and practicing UX design, interaction design, human-centered design, but certainly also working in the university sector as a strategic designer. And Steve sort of complementing that in the book narrative through his practice in industry. So for me, life-centered design is an important shift away from centering everything we do as designers in terms of the decisions we make, the things we design, the things we create, from centering those around the needs of the human, which is often the user or the customer or the consumer, and considering sort of the broader environment, the broader picture, which means decentering the human, which means considering other groups that might be marginalized groups or groups at the fringes, and also considering the needs of those entities that are non-human. So that's also a really important aspect of life-centered design. And another important consideration in life-centered design is having both a systems thinking approach and a futures focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's great to get a kind of a definition of that, but I'd be keen to understand like where you see the industry shifting towards more of this life-centered approach. Like up until 10 years ago, a lot of the community, and from my experience and my perspective, was looking inwards, and it was looking at, kind of how to improve the processes and how we can get greater outcomes and stuff. But it seems over the last number of years, there's definitely been a societal shift towards more life-centered thinking and our outcomes and actually sustainability practices. What's driving that from a human behavior, do you think?
I think sort of part of it for me, Gerry, comes from a good, hard, cold look at the sort of ideology driving a lot of our tech industry over the last 5 to 10 years, and just sort of looking at it as this increasingly venture capital fed, for-profit, hyper-growth, with a focus on going, like an IPO, right? Like is the point, rather than the design of something of value that creates value rather than extracts value, that solves real problems rather than pretends to, or in some cases actually, actively creates these problems. And I think as a group of people who are quite naturally empathetic and quite naturally reflective, went through their careers and saw what was effectively just a fairly grubby, greedy,
superficial
industry, like driven by this venture capital money, really started to take a look at ourselves, and I put myself in that mix, but we really started to take a look at ourselves and ask questions like, well, why? And when we start to look around, we start to see massive piles of waste and pollution being produced. We see energy being used for no real purpose, like some really trivial and frivolous uses, treated in a way as though they're abundant when really they're scarce, especially when there's 7 billion, approaching 8 billion people on the planet, all trying to live this really sort of hyper-consumptive lifestyle. These are not good recipes. And as I say, for an industry that is quite reflective, we start to look around and question, well, what is our role in that? And is that really how we want to be spending our time? And is there maybe something else that we want to be doing? And if you are of a certain age, maybe you've got kids and you're starting to think that, well, perhaps the future that I'm creating for them is not the one that I really want for them. And so we start to make different choices, and we at least start to ask different questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a little bit of a step back towards the Martin and Steve relationship. How did you guys get together to write this book? And I want to see, rose petals, and I want to see lots of fun stories woven into this. I'm only joking, of course. How did you guys get together?
You asked earlier when Martin arrived in Sydney, but we met not long after that. And I don't recall exactly where we met, but way back at the beginning of Meld Studio. So in 2009, when we were planning Meld Studios, I was working independently, and I was looking to bring on an intern. And it was Martin that I reached out to help me find an intern. And so Martin actually found me my first intern in 2009. And we've been connected ever since. But we both gave talks at UX Australia in 2021 looking at this issue of what is the role of design today, particularly in its contribution to, modern society and the impact that we're having on the natural world and on our environment, and looking ahead at what role design might play in addressing those issues and maybe taking a different stance when it comes to things like, who are we designing for, who gets to design, who gets to benefit, and how that sits within a natural environment. Yeah. Positioning us not as controlling nature, but a part of nature. And Martin approached me afterwards and said, there's a lot of complementarity with those talks. Let's work on that as an idea and as a project.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I love the fact that there's two people who wrote this book is it's not a singular perspective. Steve's experience in industry, and Martin, I'm sure you probably worked in industry as well, but I guess your primary role over the last number of years has been looking at, educational and academia and design academia. What role do you think design academia has had over the last 20 years in producing designers that maybe were, let's just say, too into navel gazing? And what's their role in that space, and how is it adapted now? How is the educational models adapted to design for the future?
Yeah, when I started teaching design at the University of Sydney in 2009, we were running an interaction design program there, a bachelor, which launched, I believe it launched around 2002. So it was really ahead of its time. And it sort of came out of being a stream in the Bachelor of Architecture, looking at computing in architecture and using computing as a tool. And then it became its own degree in its own right. But it was at a time when there was no UX industry, really.
True.
And so at the time, of course, we were very much focusing on user experience design. The industry started to emerge. It was still really hard to talk to students, to explain to students and parents at Open Day what it is. It became easier every year as the field grew and people became more aware of the role of UX design and what good design means in particular in the tech sector. So I remember, when we first connected with Meld Studios and Steve, and as a design academic, I also was very, very closely observing what the industry was doing and very much engaging with the industry, going to meetups and also bringing industry into the programs so that we can connect what we do in academia and how we teach our students with what's happening in industry. And so I also met Steve again a number of times at UX Australia, where I spoke a few times, and usually I was the only academic at UX Australia.
You and Ben
Graal, who has since left the university sector.
Yeah,
I'm still here. So I think for me, it's always been really important to connect those two perspectives so that we as academics are not completely operating in isolation. At the same time, it is really important, I believe, for academia to kind of explore a little bit what the future might look like. And maybe sometimes we have the advantage, we don't have clients that pay for our projects. We can sort of decide as a design researcher what we want to explore and what we want to focus on. So we can be very experimental. And I think what's happened, in mostly reflecting on my own practice, I guess, is that there was a shift over the last 10 to 15 years from focusing on the interaction design. So we're looking at the more detailed experience that people have with technology. And again, in our case, often very experimental settings, to looking at the broader perspective and looking at the methodology and how we can shift from a human-centered design to a more responsible approach to using design, and also therefore bringing that more responsible approach to students and into the design education. So I was really interested that you mentioned that life-centered design is becoming an increasingly used approach in industry. It's really amazing to hear that. I've been teaching, I've been helping our students to learn about this approach for a number of years now, but I'm also recently starting to become aware that this is a term that is actually finding traction in industry, which is really, really exciting, I think.
Absolutely. I don't know if you know Heike van Dijk and Bas from Standby in Amsterdam and London. They were the ones who introduced it to me in 2018. So it was at that point, it was actually, this is me name dropping, it was John Thackeray, actually, when I was doing a conference in Barcelona when I came home from Australia. He just said something along the lines of, like, you know, when are you going to realize that human-centered design isn't going to solve the world? And I kind of go, I know that, but at the same time, like, it's a stepping stone to where we all want to get to. And then Heike joined that conversation. I remember they were outside. And we started talking about life-centered design. And I was like, actually, you know what? Maybe that's too far away from some of my clients at that stage. Yes, but it's definitely, I think it's definitely picked up traction. You can see, all you have to do is Google life-centered design now. And I did have a moment where I was like, man, maybe I need to rename the business to life-centered design, or this is life-centered design. And it has crossed my mind, I tell you what, more than once.
But I think, Gerry, like, a lot of the work that we are talking about, and and I'm sure this is true for a lot of the audience of the podcast, that we approached the practice of design within a context that was largely technological for a lot of us, right? So human-centered design, as we think about it, a lot of it sits within a technological domain. Certainly UX and interaction design and information architecture are all within that technological domain. And it was an attempt to overcome a very engineering-centric approach to the creation of technology and technological products. We didn't involve people in that practice. And so positioning it as human-centered design was an important way of taking an engineering-centric approach. And we still fight that today. We still see these large tech firms that are heavily engineering-centric. But like I remember when we started Melt Studios, like back in 2010, we had this clear arc that we were following away from the design of technological systems and interfaces and these sort of detailed design of interfaces out into these larger things. There's an article I wrote in 2010, I think it was, which talked about the strategic arc of interaction design, and it got out to things like public policy and transportation systems and, open systems and the way in which you would approach that differently. So the roadmap has been there for quite some time. The inclusion of actors and non-human actors in the map of who needs to be taken into account and what needs to be taken into account and for whose benefit we're designing is a really welcome addition to the tool set. And that idea of saying, well, actually, I need to have some presence or some questioning in the design process that says, well, what about our waterways, and what about our wildlife, and what about our, precious natural resources that will be depleted or polluted in this process? How are we going to protect those? How are we going to regenerate those along the way? And it's really good to see those sorts of tools. Non-human personas, Martin, is one that we talk about in the book as a particular example. It's good to see those sorts of things coming into more regular practice.
Yeah. I want to go back to the question from Martin, where we were talking about educational systems and stuff. What I'm hearing when you were answering that question was like the exploratory nature of exploring the full domain of what's kind of out there on Earth and on life. If we're producing those designers with that massive mindset and that capability to think like that, which is fantastic, there seems to be a disconnect if they go out into industry. The outcomes that we measure most likely from academia is placement into jobs. If they're too broad thinking, is there a risk there that industry might see it as they're too blue sky, they're too green fields? We wouldn't be able to work with a designer like this. We just want them to be able to hit the ground running. I know the answer to that question in terms of, well, we still need to get them into the business. So there's this kind of tension between the two worlds. And I think the people listening to this podcast most likely are in that world at the moment. Mm-hmm. What advice do you give to other academic practices out there at the moment? So question number one, to make sure that they're still able to get into the organization to hopefully transform it and help enable a better outcome. And then two, for people listening to who are in businesses that want to experience this transformation, this kind of thinking, this exploration, dropping the seeds across the organization to let it flourish. Both of you, what advice do you give to those people, to those two questions?
Do I start with one, Steve, and you go to two?
Yeah, look at this.
Also, you probably also have a different perspective on one than me. So let's start with one.
You go with one.
I mean, for me, and that's one of the things that attracted me in terms of moving to the transdisciplinary school here at UTS is that we have very strong industry engagement in our programs. And while from the program sort of spun out originally out of the design school, and from the outside, people still think it's a design thinking based course in many ways. But from the inside, it's not design thinking at all. It's transdisciplinary. So it's using different approaches, different ways of thinking. And a really important one that our students here have to learn very early on is systems thinking. And then there's also futures thinking and there's creativity and other approaches. And so we sort of really stretch the minds of our students in that way and help them to ask the right questions, to make the right connections, use creativity to connect the dots. And at the same time, we're also bringing industry into the classroom, working alongside the students and with the students to make sure this is still grounded. That's also a really important aspect of transdisciplinarity, that it's still grounded in the real world and there's a real impact. Yeah. And that produces actually really highly employable graduates. Our employability, the employability of our students is like in the mid 90%.
Wow,
compared
brilliant.
To 76% or so the university average. And that's I think really both because of the way they learn to think and because of the industry engagement. And so I don't think those two are sort of contradicting each other in a way, or that students are not disadvantaged by learning about life-centered design and other approaches, systems thinking. It's actually
absolutely not.
I think it's a superpower for them. But having said that, when I give as head of the school, I don't have so much time to teach these days, but when I give guest lectures, and especially with the new book, talking about the new book on life-centered design, I always have design students come up to me afterwards and say, I want to do this. I want to make this my career. Where can I go and work? And that is really tough, because even a strategic designer in a sort of more traditional way, there's not that many roles still. And so that's still, I think that the industry still is a little lagging behind potentially. But what I'm hoping is that those students equipped with the skills can go into the industry and start, I guess, also having a conversation about these new ways of thinking and working and using and doing design.
Absolutely.
I think on the flip side of that question, so how does the business respond when a student comes in who's thinking and wants to work in a particular way, and that's not the way the business works? So are these students really right for us? Is the university doing its job to produce students like this?
Exactly.
The other thing that happens is the students get disenfranchised as well, and they get disillusioned, and they think that maybe they're in the wrong career, or at least if all workplaces are like this one, then maybe I've taken on the wrong role in life, right? So there's that aspect to it as well. But let me start with a story. So in 1974, I think it was, the State Library of Victoria was in the process. They had decided they were going to digitise their index card. So, like most libraries at the time, they had these sort of analogue index cards, rows and rows and rows and drawers and drawers and drawers of physical index cards that kept the collection. They were in the process of digitising it, and they realised that they had no idea how to go about doing it. Like they just weren't skilled enough. It needed to be done. They had the funding to do it, but they just didn't have the personnel. They certainly didn't have the capacity to do it, let alone the capability. So they went across the road. If you're familiar with the State Library of Victoria, just across the road is RMIT, or at least one of RMIT's buildings. They went across the road and they went and spoke to the graduating class in library science in 1974. And they said, hey, you are studying digital record keeping and digital information systems. Do you want a job at the library? And they basically hired out the graduating class in 1974 and took them across to the library. And when I was there working in 2014, a lot of them were still there. They were older reference librarians 40 years later, still working in the thing, still working in the library. But the thing that got them in the door in the first place was an externally imposed need upon the library to modernise. Now, the reason I mention that story is because the same thing is about to happen to most businesses that make stuff, that sell stuff, that distribute stuff, and it will have implications because of the supply chain nature of modern society and modern production. It will have implications as well for anyone who develops software, anyone who runs an app, anyone who runs a digital service, a data center, or the energy that supplies them. And that is the EU's extended producer responsibility and carbon adjustment border adjustment mechanism, which will require organisations to have a very clear understanding of their entire end-to-end supply chain, will put in place not only the reporting about those things, but some mandates in place around where they source their materials, the type of materials they source, the durability of those materials, the repairability of the things that they're producing, and the provenance of all of it. And Australia has recently adopted a similar framework. And that kind of external shift is going to hit organisations. Australia has a 2030 deadline for ours. I think the EU is even shorter.
Yeah.
And suddenly an awful lot of organisations are going to be turning around and looking at schools like Martin's and saying, for God's sake, can we have those kids, please?
Yeah, we need them.
Can we have those students? Because suddenly it used to be a bit painful having these kids, with ideas that we didn't want anything to do with. And now they are going to need that thinking and need that skill set, the ability to think in systems, the ability to map our supply chains, the ability to undertake life cycle analyses and various other tools along the line.
Yeah.
And it will be a regulatory requirement for them to do so. And I think we're going to have something similar. And those students are going to replace the ones who 5 or 10 years ago were disillusioned and didn't keep up with those skills. But they are absolutely going to come out of schools like UTS and go, okay, I can help.
Absolutely. I mean, any of the students that I met when I was in Australia that came out of UTS, University of Sydney, COFA, they were all brilliant. I don't know what it is about the DNA in the Australian design school system, but every single person that I met, I was just like, wow, okay, they're pretty remarkable. So it's absolutely not a question pointing the finger at anyone there about like producing the wrong thing.
Absolutely
I think
not, right?
it's fantastic.
But it's the environments that they go into, Gerry, and I think that's sort of part of the point of the question.
Huge problem.
Are the organisations who are hiring them ready to make good use of that mindset and those skills? And I think the time is coming where they are forced to, where they won't get to say no.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember years and years ago leaving as an industrial designer in 2002, and I could not find a job. I was like, I remember being interviewed in Sydney in 2002 or 2003 the first time, and they're like, "So did you study psychology?" And I was like, "Nope." They were like, they weren't really interested, because it was a field full of psychologists at the time. And then suddenly a few years later, like whenever the UX scene started to open up, I was like, all that stuff that I studied is suddenly relevant now. So it's not about the time, it's usually about the timing in a lot of these situations. Is really interesting. So let's go back to the book, okay? Because this is why we're kind of here. It is called Designing Tomorrow, okay? I want to talk about the roles and responsibilities of designers and organizations. We've touched on it a little bit around, if you want, the producers of designers, I guess the design schools in academia. But where do you see the future of design in regards to how it lives within organizations and governments as well, to ensure that we're actually moving forward? And if you've got any practical advices in under 100 words on how you can get this started in governments, I'd love to hear it. I'm only joking. But I'd love to know any advice that you could give to people listening who are in governments at the moment, who have been talking about this stuff. A lot of my clients have been talking about this stuff for a very long time, and they're struggling. They're struggling at the moment.
Maybe I'll start again, Steve, if that's okay. In particular, again, you're probably better placed to answer the second part of that question. And in a way, we also haven't actually answered your second question from earlier, but it's connected, I think, in terms of how people can start within organizations. And that's how we really thought about the book, and also what drove the structure of the book. So the book presents 3 pillars for strategic design, and each of those pillars has 3 strategic design tactics. So 9 strategic design tactics in total, and they each include tools and strategies. So we really tried to make it really accessible and actionable, and allowing people to start small. And we make a big point about this idea of 1% change in the book. And we can maybe later unpack what that means. But to come back to your question, for me, the way the role of design is changing, and I've been asked by a colleague to give a guest lecture about the future of design in a few weeks. So I need to think about that, actually. For me, that's really shifting towards, it's not like AI. For me, that's shifting how we do design and the role of the strategic designer. And I don't know if you've read the book, A Fine Line by Hartmut Esslinger, founder of Frog Design.
No.
It's not a very widely noted book, wasn't widely noticed. And didn't have a big uptake, which is interesting. It's really brilliant, and he talks about his experience, of course, founding Frog and working with I think Sony and Apple, and he also presents quite a clear vision for what a strategic designer is, and how a strategic designer is able to understand people and their needs, but also has the understanding of technology, and is able to apply business and economic thinking. And I think that's the key, that strategic designers are able to connect all of those things. And that's why, coming back to what I said earlier, for me, a design strategy sits in the strategy department. And there's often confusion, and particularly in the US, design strategy and strategic design are used in the same way, but it's usually kind of using design thinking or human-centered design to help a company develop a strategy. But strategic design is completely embedded across the organization. Side. It's part of the DNA of the organization. It works across the departments. That's also why transdisciplinarity, again, being really important. Strategic designers have to be able to think in transdisciplinary ways and speak different languages, be able to bring all of these things together. So yes, the tools influence strategy, but they also understand the customers, they understand the bigger system, the unintended consequences. So they're able to bring all of these things together to shift the organization, and really importantly, have the ability to apply futures thinking, or bringing methods for futures thinking into the work. And so they can slowly nudge the organization in the right direction, in very subtle but powerful ways.
Meaningful ways. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Steve, would you like to add to that?
Where I see design being positioned in the future in a way that we haven't seen yet is in the boardroom. So not at that executive level, but at that board level, in roles where the role of the board is to ensure that good questions are being asked. Right? So are we asking the right questions that allow us to assess risks, that allow us to look towards the horizon and make sure that we are giving ourselves time to not only take on opportunities, but to avoid risks along the way? That, I think, is something that we will see more of with design, and that the role of design will start to be asking good questions at that board level, and then contributing to the way in which the executive and the management teams within the organization actually deliver on those answers and help the organization navigate that complexity.
I love that. Go ahead, Martin.
Can I just also, because there's a great academic paper that talks about the rise of strategic design, and it compares strategic design to design thinking. And it's very aligned to what you're saying, Steve, about asking questions. One of the things it says is in the paper, the academic says that design thinking is about problem solving, but strategic design is also about problem setting. Yes. And that's, I think, connected to asking the right questions. And also interesting what you're saying, Steve, in terms of that it's not on the executive level, because I think we have seen that during the era of design thinking, where lots of big corporations created chief design officer or chief experience officer roles. Yeah. And I mean, in Australia, I can think of at least 3 big organizations where recently they discontinued that role. So it's almost a bit of an experiment maybe in companies.
And I understand why.
And it's interesting to see how that's shifting.
Yeah. But if why? And I know a few of those roles, right? Like I know a few of the organizations that we're talking about which have that sort of chief experience officer, chief customer officer. But in most cases, that person does not have responsibility for the experience. They get to talk about it, they get to measure it, they get to, collaborate with others, but they don't have a budget, they don't control the outcomes, they don't have the authority to make changes for that experience. And so they don't really have the means to impact it. So if I'm the organization and I'm looking at, this sort of C-suite role, a chief experience officer who doesn't have direct revenue raising capabilities, who isn't directly responsible for reducing costs, and who isn't on the hook or accountable for change and outcomes within, it's all within somebody else's department, I'd get rid of them as well. Yeah. And I'm surprised a lot of them didn't quit in frustration anyway.
Yeah. So, were you going to say something there, Martin? No? You all good?
No, just agreeing with that.
On that point, so just on the topic of building on this, when it comes to those kind of the future of design within organizations, what are the steps we can get to ensure that 1% change, I think how that can compound really over time? Because in my experience when I'm working with local governments and even when I'm training them, it's very hard to visualize this impact across the organization, because these organizations aren't made up of 5 or 10 people. There's thousands and thousands of people. And one of the big blockers that I'm seeing for executives in particular is being able to actually visualize what's actually happening and where they can strategically put their money and their investments. What advice do you give to those organizations who are struggling with that? Well, what are the things that they can lean more into at this stage, so that sets them up nicely for maybe a third horizon?
The biggest thing for me is to start mapping the system within which they operate and include outside of their organization in that system map. And the reason why I say that is because it forces them to reassess
100%.
where they draw their boundary in terms of their sphere of influence. It's not only within the walls of their organization, it's absolutely outside the walls of their organization. But the first step in actually recognizing that and then taking responsibility for the decisions that impact further upstream and further downstream is that system map. So once that's in place, the next step for me is to start moving away from this idea of first order direct impacts and start thinking about flow-on effects, the ripple effects, the second, the third order effects, and start asking yourself the question, might I achieve longer lasting and more impactful results with a second order or indirect intervention in this system instead of trying to go hard at it with a first order and direct thing? And once you start thinking in those sorts of terms, I'm going to build up momentum bit by bit and come at it rather than trying to tackle this big thing, right? Like if you think about the impact of, like if I had, let's say I had a pile of rocks and I was standing next to a building and I was throwing rocks at that building, I'd tire myself out really, really quickly, right? But if I run up the hill and start throwing rocks at the side of the hill and start an avalanche, I'll take that building out without any trouble whatsoever. And we need to think more like that. Not necessarily about destruction of public property, but about the use of those compounding effects that come from a smart intervention, that has a compounding effect like an avalanche does. What is it we can do that's within our means that will build over time such that the problem that we're trying to solve will be overwhelmed?
Up over time. Yeah.
And
that's a really, really good point. So being able to identify those opportunities. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's solid advice. Now I've got one question on this point, okay, and it's kind of going to wrap up where we're at in this conversation. And perhaps if you're open to it, we could come back for a second conversation on this, because it's fascinating to talk so openly about these challenges. When you're working in that space, and you mentioned there that the CDO, you're surprised that some of them didn't resign, and would have been so, utterly frustrating and heartbreaking at times where you're up against that rock. What is the role of academia and organizations to ensure that the resilience is maintained for designers when they're working in these spaces? Because, as you mentioned there, Martin and the team at UTS and other academia functions across the world can produce the world-class best designers. They're super resilient. And then they go into these organizations and they're hitting their heads against the wall. We don't want them to leave. We want them to sustain and remain and fight the fight, so to speak, to ensure that 1% is being adhered to and met. But that takes a lot of resilience building, and that's something that might be missing in the academic model at the moment, and also the organizational duty of care. Do you have any advice to designers who are currently going through it? So you can see what's happening in the US at the moment. Designers are all being laid off in the US government and the digital services. This isn't a time for, we need to think proactively about how we can actually ensure that their well-being is being met.
I think, from my perspective, I think we have a responsibility as academics and educators to not only train students in methods, techniques, tools, strategies, but also prepare them for the future work environments or roles and organizations they're going into. So avoiding that, to have that shock from where they leave university, where they often maybe work on like fiction, in some cases work on fictional briefs and create an amazing portfolio, but then sort of hit really hard by reality. So again, we're doing that by bringing industry in, but also by sending students out into doing internships. But I think we need to put more efforts on that. Of course, universities are not places where we're not just about skills and skills training, but it's about a certain being able to learn. Essentially, universities are helping students to be lifelong learners in a way, and that's part of also resilience building. And I think, we sort of another component around resilience building is to I want to say, I'm not sure if it totally applies, but I want to say sort of throwing students into multiple challenges throughout the degree so that they, in many ways that builds resilience in that students are trained to be able to deal with uncertainty and complexity. And we see that now where we have transdisciplinary programs where students from across the university come together to do specific subjects with us. And the science students are often the ones that really struggle with that because they really want to know what they have to do exactly. And they're being thrown into this environment where they have a barely defined challenge that is complex and really hard to understand and untangle and don't know where to start. And so, I believe that's also building resilience. And maybe the third component from me, and I see that sort of really rising here in Sydney at the moment, is the role of the community. And that's in the form, for example, of meetups that I think play a really important role to help people build resilience, because you realize you're not alone with your struggles. You're not alone with the challenges of whether it's finding a job or trying to convince your client about doing the right thing. And you can talk to each other in that community in a meetup format.
Yeah, I love it.
I'd go
Steve,
further than that, Martin.
Yeah.
Look, the thing that I would add, and I think that last point, Martin, that you were making is really, really critical. I think part of the challenge for us as an industry is that in a lot of ways, we're trying to operate on our own within our own organisation, maybe with our own team, etc. So the community meetups are really, really important. But equally, if you are in an industry or a design-related industry that has a union, join the union. If you're in an industry that has an industry association, the Society of Industrial Design, the Institute of Architects, the Australian Graphic Design Association, and the equivalents in other parts of the world. The Interaction Design Association used to be one as well that, I was clearly a part of for quite some time. Those collective activities are really, really critical for exactly the reason that you just said, Martin. It helps us realise that we are not alone. It helps us realise that there are other people attempting to do the same things that we are. And equally, those different organisations and those different collectives are able to put their weight behind public programs that say, actually, as a community and as an industry, we're not happy with the way you're engaging in business. We're not happy with the profit motive. We're not happy with the way you're spoiling the environment. We're not happy with these choices around consumption and waste. And we want to see you do better. And I think that's where that resilience stops being an individual trait and starts being an industry and a communal trait. And that's where the real strength comes.
Oh, excellent. One last thing. If you're listening and you're in an organization and you're like, I don't get any of this and I don't have to worry about it, it's not going to affect me. What advice do you give to those people in getting started, and what's the first step that they can do? And Steve, you're not allowed to say hire designers. I want them to take the first step themselves personally. What advice would you give them to help their organizations think about designing tomorrow?
So I think any individual within an organization can start thinking of the system within which they operate. I think that's important. Yeah. I think the first thing I would encourage people to do is go and learn for themselves what happens to their product when it's finished. How do people get rid of it? How is it treated once it leaves your warehouse or your showroom? Go and take a look. Go and ask people. How long is it kept? How is it treated? How is it disposed of? Go and find out. Go and find out how it's made. Go and find out how the materials are sourced. Go and find out how it's harvested or cut down, or where it's produced from. Go and look at the conditions of the workers in those locations. See for yourself. And then when you come back to the office, start asking questions around, am I comfortable with those situations? And what might I do differently instead? That'd be my starting point.
I love it. Excellent. I love that, Steve. Martin, what would your take on that be? Anything else to add?
Yeah, maybe to have a close look at the KPIs and whether the KPIs are measuring the right thing, and whether there are other things that are being missed that need to be measured. Mm-hmm. And one way to find that, to test it, is to use like future thinking and project into the future what the organization might do and look like in, say, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and how KPIs might be different at that point, and then sort of bringing that back to the now. And not all of them will be relevant in the now, but there might be some that can inspire that. And it's also a method that can be used really easily in any kind of meeting, sort of start looking at the future and working backwards. So it's a method we call backcasting. So working backwards from a future scenario. So really kind of like opening up the mind and trying to think differently about the organization.
Like a reverse engineering. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love it. So folks, I'm going to give away a copy of the book. I'll purchase this myself and I'll ship it to anywhere in the world. Ideally, if you win it and you're in somewhere like America or in Australia, we'll buy it locally so we can reduce the carbon emissions. Great. Steve and Martin, I wrap up every conversation by thanking you for your vulnerability, coming on the show, letting me go left, right, up and down, and sometimes backwards as well. So thank you for giving me your time and your energy. I know it's probably a little bit later in the evening for you as well, and I really, really appreciate it. You're always welcome back in the show to talk about this stuff. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Pleasure, Gerry.
So thanks so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
It's been really great chatting to you. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Anytime.